Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the session 5 of the advanced workshop. We are awaiting Professor Datta to join us. He is going to speak today on how to read a paper of diagnostic test. So we'll wait for a few minutes for him to join.
Thank you very much and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you again, Professor Dr. Raj Purkar, Dr. Valentine Lobo, and Dr. Atul Mule for this opportunity. So this afternoon, I will be discussing a little bit about diagnostic tests, and we will do a critical appraisal of a paper on diagnostic tests. So what am I going to cover in this talk? There will be a very brief talk preceding it. I'll be covering the concepts of pre and post-test probability. What is the meaning of a treatment threshold in the context of diagnostic tests? What are likelihood ratios? I'll go over a few examples converting pre-test probability to post-test probability using likelihood ratios. And then how to evaluate papers on diagnostic tests. So we'll discuss the theory part of evaluating papers before we actually go on to evaluating an actual published paper. What will not be covered in today's talk, as these have already been covered during the basic course and you're expected to know it, are the concepts of gold standard and index test. What is sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, and negative predictive value? So I'm assuming all of you know the definitions and the formulae for these. What are the effects of prevalence on predictive values? How do you decide cutoffs for tests which have continuous outcomes? That means tests which are not binary. And what are ROC curves and area under the ROC curve? So I will not be touching upon these either during the presentation or during the chat sessions. Okay, so first, this concept of tests and disease probability. This is a very important slide because this concept keeps recurring again and again whenever we talk of diagnostic tests. So when a patient comes to us for the first time with a bunch of items on history and examination, we mentally slot the patient in a scale of probability of disease, starting from 0% chance of the disease, which is equivalent to saying that the gold standard is negative, the patient does not have the disease, all the way to 100% chance of the disease, where we think that the gold standard test is positive. That means it is certain that the patient has the disease. There is a zone close to the 100% chance of a disease, where even though the patient does not have 100% chance of the disease, it is falling short of 100%, we still think that the probability of the disease being present is so high that we are willing to go ahead and start treatment. We don't necessarily wait till we are 100% certain. And this happens in day-to-day life. We are always treating when we think the probability of the disease is good enough to start treatment. On the other hand, there is a zone of probability which is close to zero, where we think the chances of the disease being present is so low that we say that, well, it's no point in testing any further. We are just going to observe this patient and do nothing. Most of the times we are in the zone of uncertainty. So there are two thresholds that we're dealing with which we have to cross. One is the test treatment threshold. So the zone of uncertainty is a zone where we would like our diagnostic tests to be most useful, to be able to allow us to cross this threshold and to go into the zone of treatment, or from the zone of uncertainty to the zone of discharge. So before doing the test, the probability of the disease, or in other words, the pre-test probability, is in this yellow zone. After doing the test, we want the probability of the disease, or in other words, the post-test probability, to be in either one of these two zones, either the zone of treatment where we will start treating, or in the zone of observation where we will do no further tests. But there is no use having a test which leaves you in a zone of uncertainty even after you have done the test. That's not a very desirable situation. So let's go over this concept again with a real life example, pre and post test probabilities. So suppose patient comes to a doctor with cough, expectoration, and fever for 3 weeks and has lymphadenopathy. So this is the initial data that you have with you. The doctor makes a guesstimate of the probability of tuberculosis based upon two things. One is the overall prevalence of tuberculosis amongst all those who present similarly, and this the doctor knows from prior knowledge, epidemiological data of the country where he or she is working in, and so on. And the second thing is this individual patient's clinical condition, based on which he arrives at a guesstimate of the probability of tuberculosis. So remember, no test has been done yet. So this is known as the pre-test probability of tuberculosis. Now the doctor gets a test done, say a chest X-ray. The chest X-ray, there are two possibilities. Either the chest X-ray may be positive, chest test is positive, or the test is negative. That means the chest X-ray is either showing features of tuberculosis or it is not showing features of tuberculosis. This changes the probability of tuberculosis. So if the test is positive, our question is that if the test is positive, what is now the probability that the patient has tuberculosis? So he already started off with a pre-test probability based on his history and examination. And on top of that, the test is positive. So now the probability has moved upwards. So there are two questions. If the test is positive, I'm asking myself, is the probability of tuberculosis high enough that the doctor can start treatment, or is the doctor still uncertain? That means, have I crossed that test treatment threshold? If the test is negative, my question is the probability of tuberculosis now so low that the doctor need not investigate any further, or is the doctor still uncertain? So you're basically trying to do tests that are taking you out of the zone of uncertainty into either a probability where you will either definitely start treatment, or you will say, okay, fine, no further investigation. Okay. Now, how do you decide on these test treatment thresholds? Now, let me give you an example. If you're dealing with a disease which is rare, progression is slow, immediate fatality is less, therapy has a lot of side effects, duration of therapy is long, cost is high, and the consequences of over-treating are very bad, you will have a high threshold for treatment. Typical example is cancer chemotherapy. I mean, nobody, generally speaking, would start chemotherapy unless you're more than 95% certain that you are dealing with a particular type of malignancy that you have been able to identify. On the other hand, if the disease is common, progression is rapid, immediate fatality is high, which means you don't have the luxury of waiting for a few days. Let's assume that the pre-test probability is about 40%. So the post-test probability after getting a positive test result is basically you're saying how many are culture positive amongst all those who are test positive. And suppose that turns out to be 60%. That is the post-test probability after a positive test. On the other hand, hello? On the other hand,
yes,
the post-test probability after a negative test is how many are culture positive amongst all those who were test negative. Suppose that is 20%. And 20% was, say, in a particular example, sensitivity was 78%, specificity was 74%. Then the likelihood ratio of a positive test would be sensitivity upon 1 minus specificity, which is converting it into decimals, it would be 0.78 divided by 1 minus 0.74, which is 0.78 divided by 0.26, which works out to be 3. So likelihood ratio of a positive test for this example would be 3. Likelihood ratio of a negative test, 1 minus sensitivity by specificity. So it would be 1 minus 0.78 divided by 0.74, which would be 0.22 by 0.74, which would be 0.3. So let's imagine a test sepsis. C-reactive protein for the diagnosis of sepsis has a positive likelihood ratio of 3, a negative likelihood ratio of 0.3. It is nomogram known as Fagan's nomogram. To the left is a vertical line of the pre-test probability. To the right is a vertical line of post-test probability, and in the middle is likelihood ratio. So the and the post-test probability ranges from 0.1% at the bottom to 99% at the top. Your true positive rate is equal to your false positive rate, or your true negative rate is equal to your false negative rate. So it extends from 1000 through 1 and goes all the way down to 0.001. Just taking it forwards. So I'm putting again those red zones, yellow zones, and green zones that the nomogram doesn't come with these because the thresholds for yellow to red and yellow to green depend on the disease that you're dealing with. So I have just arbitrarily put that the treatment would start at a probability level of 50% or more for sepsis. Do more tests. That means the zone of uncertainty is from say 2% to 50%. And we will observe if we think the probability of sepsis is less than 2%. So similarly, in an inverted scale, on the other side is observe, do more tests, and treat at exactly the same thresholds. Now let us take the example of C-reactive protein, which has a positive likelihood ratio of 3 and a negative likelihood ratio of 0.3. Supposing I start with a patient who's moderately sick, and I think mentally that the pre-test probability of it being sepsis is approximately 30%. So here's where we are starting. So I am at a zone where we should be doing more tests, because I can neither say that I should definitely treat or that we should observe. So supposing we do a CRP, and the CRP is, so CRP positive has a likelihood ratio of 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line that connects the 3 of likelihood ratio and extend the line to see where it is cutting the post-test probability. It is cutting which is within the zone of treatment, because anything above 50% probability I will treat for sepsis. So therefore, in such a patient, if my CRP is positive, I will treat this patient with antibiotics. So anyone who is moderately sick, whose CRP is positive, the message is that I will treat if the CRP comes positive. On the other hand, if the CRP test comes negative, so you know a likelihood ratio of a negative test was 0.3. So I will draw a line from 30%, cutting it at 0.3, extending it. It's crossing it at the mark. I'm still in a zone of uncertainty in the yellow zone. That means I have to do more tests. I cannot say for sure that this patient just merits observation. The chances of sepsis are so low that I don't need to do anything. I can just observe, because it is still a 10% probability. So I need to do more tests to exit from this zone of uncertainty. Let's take another example. Suppose the patient was only mildly sick, that means not moderately sick, and the pre-test probability was just 5% chance of sepsis, very mild symptoms of sepsis. So I'm starting off out here, 5% chance of sepsis. Okay, now if my CRP is positive, I'm going to connect the 5% line with the likelihood ratio of 3, see where it cuts the post-test probability. It's at about 15%. This is now in a zone of uncertainty. So that means I will have to do more tests even if my CRP is positive. So what lesson have we learned? It means that the interpretation of tests depends upon the clinical condition of the patient. Tests cannot be interpreted in isolation. You cannot just look at the number on the test report and say, based on that, decide on what you should be doing. It has to be interpreted in the context of the clinical condition of the patient. So a mildly sick patient whose CRP is positive does not merit antibiotics. because you are still left in a zone of uncertainty, around 15% probability of sepsis. However, in this patient, if the CRP is negative, so I'm drawing a line from 5 through 0.3, and it's cutting it at the post-test probability line of 1.5%, which is below my 2% mark. And so I'm in the zone of observation. So I tell myself that, oh, patient was mildly sick, test is also negative. Now the post-test probability is just 1.5%. You know, we started off with 5%, but I think now it is just 1.5%, which is so low that I can safely observe. So such a patient, we will simply observe. Now, suppose I take a more sick patient, pre-test probability of 45%, reasonably high. If my CRP is positive, the line cuts it at the 3 mark. Out here, it goes to 75%. So I will definitely treat it. The CRP is positive. But the thing is that if CRP is left in the zone of uncertainty, because it's crossing the post-test probability line at a reasonably sick patient, 45% pre-test probability, CRP negative, I still need to do more tests to be sure of where this patient should go. Let's take a different test altogether. So let's say, let's abandon CRP and say, let us take procalcitonin. And just for the sake of argument, look at the top blue box on the left. We say that the likelihood ratio of a positive procalcitonin test is 20. Likelihood ratio of a negative procalcitonin test is 0.02. So that means it is performing far better than CRP. Remember, the CRP corresponding values were 3 and 0.3. For procalcitonin, I am saying it is 20 and 0.02. So let's take exactly those same 3 patients. The first patient who had a 30% probability. Now look at this procalcitonin line. If the procalcitonin is positive from 30, it says that E, and therefore crosses the post-test probability line at above. That same patient, if the procalcitonin is negative, it goes through the 0.02 mark on the likelihood ratio line, and therefore crosses the post-test probability line at somewhere between 0.5 to 1%. So that means such a patient, now if my procalcitonin is negative, I am sure I can safely observe, because the probability of it being sepsis is just somewhere between 0.5 to 1%, as opposed to it being 30% probability before I got my procalcitonin result. If there is a very low pretest probability, mildly sick patient, only 5% chance of it being sepsis, if my procal is positive, I still have a 60% chance of it being sepsis post-test probability. So I will treat even if this mildly symptomatic patient has a positive procal. If this mildly symptomatic patient has a negative procalcitonin result, it is the post-test probability is close to 0.1%. I will definitely not treat. Now look at the third patient who started off with a pre-test probability of 45%. In such a patient, if the procalcitonin was positive, the line crosses post-test probability as 95%, so I will definitely treat, no surprises there. But if my procalcitonin is negative, it brings the probability down to somewhere between 1 to 2%, so I can safely observe this patient. So see how much better procalcitonin is compared to CRP. Regardless of your pre-test probability, wherever it may lie, if your procal is positive, you will definitely treat, because all the post-test probability values are coming in the red zone. If your procalcitonin is negative, you will definitely not treat. You will simply observe and not do any further tests, because it brings down the post-test probability to very low levels. So you need tests that have very high positive likelihood ratios and very low positive likelihood ratios, which can clearly take you into the zone of either treatment or observation, and will not leave you in the yellow zone where you still have to do more tests. So regardless of the pre-test probability, the procalcitonin post-test probability does not leave us in a limbo. So there is no patient in whom you're still left with the feeling that you should be doing more tests. So of course, I have just arbitrarily chosen likelihood ratios. In real life, the difference between procalcitonin and CRP is really not that stark when you actually take actual data from studies. Okay, so basically a test must have a positive likelihood ratio that enables you to make this jump if the test turns out to be positive, and a negative likelihood ratio that enables you to make this jump if the test turns out to be negative. Okay, now let's move on to how do you evaluate diagnostic test accuracy studies. So when you're evaluating a diagnostic test accuracy article, there are two important questions. Does it accurately distinguish those who have the disease of interest from those who do not? That's the first thing. And second is the evidence about the accuracy of the test valid? That means, is it unbiased? So back to this disease probability. So supposing a patient comes to you with some tummy ache, not looking okay, diarrhea and vomiting, you are in a zone of uncertainty as to whether this is say bacillary dysentery for which you need to give antibiotics, or it is something that you don't need to give antibiotics for. So all subjects recruited in a study, this is very important, must have signs and symptoms that would have put them in the zone of uncertainty had they presented to you in day-to-day clinical practice. That means diagnostic tests, you have to see that all subjects recruited had vague signs and symptoms that would have put them in a zone of uncertainty. The study must not recruit any normal healthy controls. It should have a good mix of target disease and the differentials, and there should be no obviously diseased subjects in the in the study. In diagnostic test studies is ascertainment. What does ascertainment mean? It means that your index test that you're doing and the gold standard test must be simultaneously done in all patients who meet eligibility criteria. And this must be done even if your gold standard test is invasive or risky and the test is negative. For example, if your gold standard test is say angiography, percutaneous coronary angiography, and your index test is say some nuclear medicine test, or it is just say a simple echocardiogram. You're comparing echocardiogram against angiography. Angiography is invasive, there are some risks involved and so on. So there may be a temptation to not do the angiography in those patients who are not very symptomatic and whom the index test echo has come completely normal. But that is fallacious. And I'm showing the fallacy here. So the fallacy is that some people do the index test first. If the test is positive and the patient looks as though he, within quotes, deserves to get the gold standard test, they say, okay, now let's go ahead and do the gold standard test. Whereas if the test is negative, the patient is not so sick and looks as though he does not, within quotes, deserve to get the gold standard test, they said, okay, let's avoid the gold standard test and let's exclude this patient altogether from the study. What happens over time is when you keep following this policy, when finally you construct your 2x2 table, so you have the gold standard positive column, gold standard negative column, test positive column, test negative column, you are going to have an over-representation of those who are test positives. So these top two cells, the test positives amongst the gold standard positive and gold standard negatives, will get over-represented, and the test negative cells will get underrepresented for the reasons that I've already mentioned. And so you will end up getting a spuriously high sensitivity and a spuriously low specificity if you adopt this approach. Why high sensitivity? Because sensitivity is amongst those who are gold standard positive, what proportion is test positive? Now you have artificially inflated the number of test positives amongst the gold standard positives simply by not doing the gold standard amongst some of the patients who were test negative, and vice versa for specificity. So this is about ascertainment. The next important thing is blinding. Very, very important. There should be a blinded interpretation of the persons, of the lab persons or whoever is doing the index test and who's doing the gold standard test to each other's results. That means they should not know each other's results. And even more important, they should be blinded to the clinical status of the patient. That means the person who is doing these tests should not be informed anything about the patient. So the form that you're sending for the research patients to, say, the radiology department, maybe, who's doing the gold standard test, or whichever department is doing the gold standard test, the details of the patient should not be mentioned on the form. No matter how much the investigation departments tell you that no, you have to provide clinical information, you should not provide clinical information, because that will remove the blinding. Once they have given the report, then in retrospect they can be provided the clinical information, but first the report has to be provided without knowing the clinical status of the patient. Otherwise, what will happen is the gold standard will be over-interpreted as positive when the test is positive and the clinical status of the patient is known, and vice versa. Similarly, when the patient is more sick, the person performing the gold standard test will be more likely to report the gold standard test as being positive rather than negative. So this results in the following 2x2 table. When the test positive, gold standard positive, the cell will be overrepresented. Test negative, gold standard negative, again overrepresented. And in the discordant cells, that means test negative, gold standard positive, there'll be very few patients. And test positive, gold standard negative, again there'll be spuriously very few patients. So you will have spuriously very high sensitivity and specificity and positive predictive value and negative predictive value. And you will think that it's a great test, but actually it is a great test because there was no blinding. The next important thing is the independence of the index test and the gold standard. Now what this means is that the test must be truly independent, and the test should not itself form a part of the gold standard assessment. So for example, at least in neonatology, common example is we cannot have our index test, that means the test that you're evaluating as C-reactive protein, and compare it against sepsis screen as the gold standard, where the CRP itself is one of the components of the sepsis screen. So the sepsis screen normally in neonatology has several components. One is CRP, the other is total leukocyte count, the third is absolute neutrophil count, and various other hematological parameters. So you can't have CRP being compared against sepsis screen, because sepsis screen by itself has CRP as one of its components. Okay, next concept, that is of confidence intervals. Now supposing there is a test which the doctors think is very expensive, and so they decide that why bother doing the test? Instead, let's just toss a coin at the bedside of the patient, and if the coin comes heads, it is cancer. If it is tails, it is no cancer. So this kind of a diagnostic test, a coin toss as a diagnostic test, would have a sensitivity of 50% and would have a specificity of 50%. Why? Because sensitivity is the proportion of times the test is positive amongst those who are truly diseased. That means amongst those who have cancer, the coin is going to fall heads 50% of the times. We know that in advance. It's not rocket science. We know it is going to fall heads 50% of the times. So a coin would have a sensitivity of 50% for diagnosing cancer. Similarly, for specificity, it is the proportion of times the test is negative amongst those who are not diseased. So amongst those who do not have cancer, the coin is going to fall tails 50% of the time. So specificity of a coin toss is 50%. And the rest can all be derived from sensitivity and specificity, which means that the lower bound of the confidence interval of our sensitivity and specificity cannot go to less than 50%, or in fact not even anywhere close to 50%. So the 95% confidence interval limits of sensitivity and specificity must be provided. Unfortunately, a lot of authors don't do that. They just provide the sensitivity and specificity, and when you have small sample sizes, they look very impressive, the sensitivity and specificity. Sensitivity of 85%, specificity 85%, but they don't provide the confidence intervals. Now, the smaller the sample size, the wider is the confidence interval. And then if you find that the lower bound of the confidence interval is creeping towards the 50% mark, it may mean that the lower bound of the truth is no better than a coin toss. So 95% confidence intervals must be provided, and you have to see how far that lower bound is away from the 50% mark. So to conclude, test results are not interpreted in isolation, but with the background knowledge of pre-test probability. The age-old teaching that don't just treat the lab report, treat the patient. You have to know the clinical status of the patient and the prevalence of the disease in your population to be able to interpret lab reports correctly. Likelihood ratio allows post-test probability to be calculated, and it can be used across populations. A good study must have the following ingredients. It must include subjects with diagnostic uncertainty. The gold standard and the index test must have been performed in all patients without prejudice. The index test must not be a part of the gold standard test. There should be a blinded interpretation of both the index test and the gold standard, and they should be blinded to the clinical status of the patient. And 95% confidence intervals must always be provided. Okay, so with that, I end the didactic part of this presentation, and we will now go over to the critical appraisal of a diagnostic test paper using the CASP checklist. So, of course, unfortunately, it's a neonatology paper. I didn't have the time to get something more appropriate for adult nephrologists, but I think it'll do. It's a very simple concept. It's nothing very hi-fi.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so you
Yes,
can go ahead and summarize it.
Yes, sir. So this is a paper which was published in 2013. This is from Wuhan, China, where it was published from.
Wuhan is, of course, Wuhan is notorious now, but
famous.
other reasons, but this had nothing to do with coronavirus at the time, and it was just a sheer coincidence that this is from Wuhan. Huh? There's no sinister design behind it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the background is that the important cause of morbidity and mortality in neonates happens to be neonatal septicemia. But the diagnosis is difficult because the signs and symptoms are non-specific. At presently, the gold standard to diagnose neonatal sepsis is blood culture. But there are a few inherent problems with blood culture. One being that it has a low sensitivity. It gives the results late, at least 2 days it takes. Third one is a concept called early onset sepsis and late onset sepsis. Let me briefly tell that to the audience, and then I will define why it's important. So early onset sepsis is one which happens before 72 hours, and late onset sepsis is one that happens after 72 hours. And
so
because
72 hours of life.
Of
72
life.
hours of
Yes,
life.
sir.
Yeah. So we're talking of newborns who are just born. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, sir. So therefore, blood culture might not be useful when in early onset sepsis because it occurs really early, and there may be some non-cultural pathogens. So because of all these fallacies, there is a need for a new test which can help either complement or replace the blood culture. So the new test in this study happens to be what is called a 16S ribosomal RNA PCR, which provides the result at 4 hours after drawing of a sample. So this is the basic background of the study, and they want to compare this to the blood culture in neonates who have sepsis. So the duration of this study was for about 4 months, and the participants were prospectively recruited. The setting is the NICU in the state of Wuhan, and the population for this study is about 700 patients with suspected neonatal sepsis. And when they were suspected, the blood culture and the blood for blood culture, which is 1 ml, and for this test that happens to be 0.5 to 1 ml, was drawn simultaneously, and they were both analyzed. So when we come to materials and methods, both these tests were done simultaneously, and they have clearly given how this assay was conducted and what were the positive controls, what were the negative controls when during the development of this assay. And eventually they tested the sensitivity of this test against the blood culture. The results, they found that this test has a sensitivity and negative predictive value of 100% when compared to the gold standard blood culture, with a specificity of 95% and 77.2% of positive predictive value. all the people who had a blood culture positive also had a PCR positive, but there were about 23 more patients who were detected positive by PCR who did not have any blood culture positive. And out of these 23, the authors mentioned that 19 had some other clinical signs, like sir mentioned sepsis screen, like raised CRP, immature to total neutrophil ratio, and those tests were positive, saying that these are the patients who may have had sepsis, which is detected or picked up by this new assay, but not by the blood culture. So finally, they concluded that it is complete. It may not replace the blood culture completely, but it is complementary.
Yeah. So I think you've summarized it exceptionally well, considering that you're not a pediatrician. I think you've really got the pulse of the paper, and you've done a great job. So now let us go on to this critical appraisal checklist, which is again from that same organization, CASP, the Critical Appraisal Skills Program, which we have been using for several other types of studies as well. So this one is for the diagnostic test study. So may I know who would be discussing the first question?
Sir, so actually there is an issue. So I will only be discussing the question 1 and 2 and
Okay.
5 and 6. Sir. So for the first question, sir, the first question is section A, that is,
So,
are the results of the trial valid?
Yeah, so everybody has got these, the paper and the checklist in front of them, I hope, because all the participants should have it with them, either a soft copy or hard copy. Otherwise, you will not really benefit from this discussion. So, yeah, go ahead with the first
The
question.
chat is saying yes, sir. So I think they all have got it. So, sir,
Sure.
the first question is, was there a clear question for the study to address? So like I have summarized that the blood culture had those fallacies. So therefore, there was a need for a new test. And the hint provided is that the question should include information about the population. Sir, the population in this study
Yeah, so
happens to be,
basically, they are telling us that there should be a clear-cut PICO question.
yes,
See, the hint is the population, the test, the setting, and the outcome. So that, for the diagnostic test, that is the PICO or PICO test question, if you want to extend the PICO test. So we have to make sure that there is a clear-cut PICO test question.
Yes, sir. So, sir, P is the population. So, population in this were suspected neonatal sepsis patients, and the number was around 706. The test is the gold standard happens to be the blood culture, and the index test here happens to be the 16S rRNA PCR. The setting, as I mentioned, sir, setting is the NICU in the state of Wuhan. And the outcomes said that it is complementary and it has a sensitivity of 100% and negative predictive value of 100% and 95.4% specific and positive predictive value of 77.2%. But they have not provided any confidence intervals along with this.
Yeah. So let's not go too far into the paper. At the present, we are simply asking, was there a clear question for the study to address? Okay.
So yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah. So where did you find that question being mentioned by the authors, that this is the question that we wanted to answer?
Sir, in the before the in the summary, sir.
So summary, yeah. So summary is not
introduction. Sir. I mean.
Okay. So the trouble is with this paper that in the introduction, and I'm going to highlight it now for you. Where is it gone? Yeah, the aim. So, so normally at the end of the introduction, the last paragraph of the introduction should have the research question.
Mm-hmm.
So that means you are in the introduction, you are building up a story as to why this study was required, and you end the introduction with, okay, this was the research question that we wanted to answer. So what was the research question? So they have written the aim of this study was to evaluate the molecular diagnosis of neonatal sepsis using PCR amplification of 16S rRNA gene. Okay, so far so good. In comparison with risk factors or clinical evidence of sepsis and to understand the pathogenetic spectrum of neonatal sepsis. Now, this is a bit of a problem because out here they are saying that the comparison is between PCR and risk factors and clinical evidence of sepsis. There's no mention of blood culture out here.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Which is misleading because somebody who's reading this paper will be completely misled by what is the actual PICO test question. So we, unfortunately in this paper, we have to search here and there for what is the PICO test question. The next place in which you find some elements or some ingredients of the PICO test question is actually in data analysis. And I'm going to scroll down to, are you all being able to see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So in data analysis, there is this sentence here. First sentence, study patients were allocated into two groups. Blood culture or PCR positive and blood culture and PCR negative. As if blood culture and PCR was one group.
Yes.
And those who are blood culture and PCR negative were the other group. But that's not how this diagnostic test ultimately was done. It was ultimately only blood culture positive and blood culture negative. And amongst them, PCR was being compared as the index test. So this is the second place where there's sort of a misleading kind of a thing. And that in turn contradicts what is there in the first line of discussion.
Yes,
they
sir.
say in the first line of discussion, is it visible on the screen?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. This study was designed to compare the utility of 16S RNA PCR with conventional PCR for detecting bacteria in blood obtained from neonates suspected of having bacterial sepsis. To me, this sentence is the most correct of the three. So in three different places, we are getting three different intentions of the author. In the introduction, somewhere in the data analysis, and finally in the discussion, you see the actual PICO test question that they should have made it very clear in the beginning itself. That this was a study to compare 16S rRNA, which is your index test, with conventional blood culture, which is your gold standard. The outcome is detection of bacteria in blood. And what is your P? That means your population, that is neonates suspected of having bacterial sepsis. So that means the true PICO test question is, amongst neonates suspected of having bacterial sepsis, that is my P, 16S rRNA PCR, which is my I, which is in intervention or exposure or index test, depending on what kind of a study you're dealing with. All that comes under the I of the PICO test. C, my comparison, is the conventional blood culture. O is a detection of bacteria in blood, that is my outcome. T, or the time, is equal to 0 because diagnostic test accuracy studies are all cross-sectional by definition, because your index test and the blood and the gold standard always have to be done in the same snapshot of time. Yes. To get a valid result. You can't do the index test today and say, okay, I'm going to do the gold standard test after 1 week. Imagine if they've done the PCR today and everybody's blood culture was being done after 1 week, then the blood culture after 1 week is no longer giving you the condition of the patient as it existed on the day the PCR was done. So the index test and gold standard always have to be done in the same snapshot of time. So all diagnostic test accuracy studies by definition are cross-sectional. Okay.
Yes.
Because they're cross-sectional and there's no time gap between the intervention and the gold standard test and the outcome, the time factor is actually 0 in a diagnostic test accuracy study. And the E, or the effect size, there is actually no effect size planned anywhere. It is there only the results. That means the study has been done and we now know what is the effect size, what is the sensitivity, specificity, likelihood ratio, and so on. But at the planning stage, when they are saying that, okay, we need to recruit so many patients because this is the effect size that we're trying to pick up, it is not mentioned anywhere. And the S in the PICO test question is study design. And the study design, of course, is a diagnostic test accuracy study. Okay. So this,
Yes.
we have to kind of read between the lines, read between the lines to get an idea of what the PICO test question must have been in the author's heads when they planned the study. So that is not how a good study should actually be done. It should be so clear that the author, the reader should be able to make out without any difficulty as to what is the PICO test question. Okay.
Yes.
Now moving on to the second question.
Second question is, was there a comparison with an appropriate reference standard? So the hint given is the reference test or test the best available indicator in the circumstances? So sir, my answer would be yes, that the blood culture is the gold standard they have mentioned, and that is what it was compared with.
Yeah. So I think in, in all infectious diseases studies, it is usually the culture, being able to grow the organism, that is your reference standard. Right? So I think there would be no arguments about this. I would agree with you that they have chosen the appropriate reference standard. And at least, I don't know how it is in nephrology, but at least in neonatology, 99% of studies would be having blood culture as the reference standard. Okay.
Yes, sir.
We know that it is not the best reference standard. We do know that there are situations where clinically you think it is sepsis, but the blood culture has come negative. But this is the hint, that this is the best available indicator under the current circumstances. Okay, which is why it is called a reference standard and not a gold standard. Gold standard is an older terminology, and gold standard always gives this false impression that it can't get any better than this. It is the gold standard. It is going to remain unchanged for all times to come. But that's not the case. Reference standard means in the current day and age, do you have anything better than this? You don't. So that becomes your reference standard. It may not be ideal, but you will have to do with it because there is nothing else which is better than this. So that becomes your reference standard. Okay. So the third question.
I would request Dr. Swati to unmute and kindly go ahead.
Good evening, sir. The third question is, did all patients get the diagnosis?
Dr. Swati, can you just introduce yourself a little bit? You are, what capacity are you working as and where are you working?
Sir, I'm first year DM resident, sir, from JIPMA, Pondicherry.
From JIPMA, Pondicherry, okay.
Yes. The third question, did all patients get the diagnostic test and reference standard? The hint given is, consider where both received regardless of the result of the test of interest. Check the 2x2 table. For this question, my answer is yes, sir. Based on the 2x2 table, all the 706 patients got both the blood culture and the 16S RNA PCR test, sir.
Yeah. So you're right that all patients did get the diagnostic test and the reference standard, but the place to check that is not necessarily the 2x2 table. Because the 2x2 table, they will be providing information about only those patients in whom both the tests were done. The 2x2 table will not have information about those patients in whom the reference standard test was not done. Right? So the place to look for that is actually the materials and methods. So if you look at paragraph 2.1 patients, it says all infants who had a blood culture drawn for a concomitant culture, etc., complete blood count CRP, were eligible for included. At the same time, an additional 0.5 to 1 ml EDTA blood was collected from the infants for the purpose of gene amplification, right? And the only exclusions were blood volume less than 500 microliters, glossally hemolyzed or clotted blood sample, right? So they did not sort of selectively do the PCR
Yes.
based on what the blood culture report was. They did it in all. So simultaneously the blood was taken and it was done in all. So that means there was this, otherwise if they are not, this is something known as verification bias, as the hint suggests. That means you are selectively doing one of the tests based on the results of the other test. Then it creates a problem, as I had mentioned in my didactic, one of my slides as well. Okay, so can we go on to question 4? Is that Aniket? You're going to
Question
take that?
number 4.
No.
Results of the tests have been influenced.
So am I audible?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, you're audible. You're audible.
Question number 4. Could the results of the test have been influenced by the results of the reference standard? So in paragraph 2.3 in DNA extraction, they have mentioned like the EDTA blood samples for PCR were blinded. So the results could not have been influenced by the result of reference standard, that is the blood culture. Sir.
Yeah.
So my answer is a no, sir.
Yeah. So EDTA blood samples for PCR were blinded and stored at -70 degrees before analysis. That means the people who are doing the PCR test were unaware of the results of the blood culture. Sometimes it can become a problem if, tests like PCR, it is usually done in batches, right? So it is quite possible to store the extracted DNA at -70 degrees for a few months and then do them all together in one batch, I don't know how many of you are familiar with, the PCR machine, but you can do several of them together. And because it is expensive, a little more expensive than blood culture, this temptation would always be there to do it in batches. By the time you're going to do it in batches, the results of the blood culture would already be available. So you have to make special efforts that the people who are doing the PCR test do not know the blood culture test results. And it seems to be the case because that is what they have said. Also, the risk factors and the clinical status had all occurred prior to the onset of suspected sepsis. So the reference standard itself could not have been influenced by this. And the clinical signs were all at onset. The blood culture would have been available only 48 hours later. So again, could not have been influenced. So we do not know, of course, whether clinical data was provided to the people doing the reference standard and the PCR. That has not been mentioned anywhere. But that is also, as I said, an important part of blinding. It is not just being blinded to each other's results, the PCR being blinded to blood culture and vice versa. Both also have to be blinded to the clinical status of the patient. So they should not know who was, very sick and who was less sick and so on and so forth. Okay, so it would have been good if that clarity had been provided in the paper. Okay, question number 5.
Yes, sir. I'll be taking that. Sir, Aniket here. Is the disease status of the tested population clearly described? Yes, sir. The hint they have given is were the presenting symptoms, disease stage of severity, comorbidity, and differential diagnosis were mentioned. Sir, presenting symptoms, they have just said that those they found either if they were clinically positive, clinically they were suspecting sepsis, or those who had raised CRP or other immature to total neutrophil count, they were suspected and then these tests were done. So the first is yes, sir. Stage of severity, sir, they have not mentioned stage of severity as in that I think was not applicable in this. Sir.
Yeah, they have not mentioned, yeah.
So the third is comorbidity. Yes, sir, they have mentioned comorbidity, But they have like grouped it into P and N. That is what you were mentioning, sir, in the methods and materials and methods, that P were considered to be blood culture or PCR or both positive, and N was neither of them were positive. So, sir, they have divided like that, and the comorbidities like weight and age and irritability, gestational age, premature rupture of membranes, as we are able to see in the table projected, they were given. So differential diagnosis were not considered in this.
Yeah, differential diagnoses are not mentioned. Yeah, so you have more or less summed it up correctly. That from the methods, it appears that all those who had suspected sepsis were eligible for inclusion in this study. Now, it would have been nice if they had given criteria for suspecting the sepsis, but that's not described anywhere.
Yes, sir.
You know, because I may have completely different reasons for suspecting sepsis than these people sitting in Wuhan. And so their results may not be applicable to me because they had a completely different set of criteria for even suspecting the sepsis. So it's always good to be transparent and tell the reader what were the criteria for suspecting sepsis. So this table 3 that you were also referring to, this comparison of the P group and the N group, it gives us a fair idea about what kind of patients they were dealing with. What was the weight, age, what kind of risk factors of sepsis, and the clinical signs. You know, so indirectly we get to know what were the clinical criteria on which they must have diagnosed the sepsis. So indirect evidence. So the fever, jaundice, irritability, feeding difficulties, etc., etc. The usual things that sick newborn infants tend to have, and a few laboratory parameters. So it does appear that these presented with diagnostic uncertainty. And this study was not in a case control design, which is a plus point. Now, what is the meaning of case control design in the context of a diagnostic text accuracy study? You know, you'll sometimes read diagnostic papers in which the authors will say, we selected 60 patients who were reference standard positive. That means blood culture or whatever positive. And we took an equal number, 60, who were reference standard negative, but whatever were their criteria. And then among them, we did the index test. Now, the problem with that kind of an approach is, it is not like a real life situation. See, in a real life situation, people are coming to you with diagnostic uncertainty. They are not coming to you with the reference standard diagnosis already known, neatly divided into 2 groups. That's number 1. Secondly, from a case control type of design where you have specifically selected a certain number of cases and an equal number of controls, you do not get an idea of the prevalence of the disease because you have artificially made the prevalence 50% by selecting, say, 60 cases who have the disease and 60 controls who definitely do not have the disease, right? In contrast to what these authors have done it the correct way. That means they took everybody with suspected sepsis, because that is how these patients will present. A certain proportion in the natural frequency in which it occurs will turn out to be diseased. So they found that 123 were diseased out of the 706. Okay. So approximately 1 in every 7 ultimately turned out to have true sepsis. So we get an idea of the prevalence of sepsis in this kind of a population. And it also gives us a more correct estimate of the sensitivity, specificity, and other parameters. So I agree with you that the differential diagnosis was not mentioned. It's always nice to tell the reader that those who did not have definite sepsis, what did they have? Okay, if they did not have definite sepsis, they had suspected sepsis. So what was the alternative diagnosis that was established in them? That is not mentioned anywhere. Okay, can we move on to question 6?
Yes, sir. The question 6 is, were the methods for performing the test described in sufficient detail? That is, hint is, was a protocol followed? Yes, sir. They have mentioned in detail how they did the blood culture and also the PCR method. in sufficient details. But one query is also been mentioned in the chat, and which I also had, is what they considered as positive for PCR. Sir, they said that the PCR they were considered positive if 2 times, when they ran the PCR test for them 2 times, it came positive, or it came positive once, but to run the second time they did not have sufficient sample. But if these patients had some clinical signs or had some other indicators of sepsis, it was considered as positive. So I think this is like a point where it was not clear, but otherwise everything was clear.
Yeah, so that's an important point which was not clear actually. So it is true that the method of doing the PCR has been very well described. So all the which were the primers used and so on. And there is something interesting that they used 2 sets of primers. All those of you who are familiar with PCR, so for any PCR reaction, you need a pair of primers, a forward and a reverse primer. These people, they used 2 pairs of primers. So one forward and reverse and another forward and reverse, with yielding 2 products. As you can see in this first paragraph, which is yellow highlighted. So the primers provided 2 PCR products, 630 base pairs and 216 base pairs. And there is some confusion after that arises as to what is a positive result. Because if you look at this yellow highlighted paragraph, which is on your screen now on the left column, it says that the results were analyzed by PCR using 2 pairs of primers whose names are given there. The PCR results were considered positive when the visible PCR products of the correct size were found simultaneously in the 2 reactions. Over here, it suggests that both the primers had to give a product for it to be called positive. And the PCR results were considered negative when there was no visible PCR of the correct size in either of the 2 primers. And results were considered inconclusive when a single positive run could not be repeated. Now, it's not clear here exactly what do they mean by repeated, because is it that the PCR had to be done twice for it to be positive, or is it that you were doing it by 2 different methods, 2 primers, and both had to be positive for it to be called positive? So there is some confusion as to, like, what do they mean by a single positive run could not be repeated? I mean, there's no question of repeating the PCR. They have done PCR by 2 different primers. Both of them were supposed to be positive. And then what is a little, not correct is that the results were then combined with clinical signs and laboratory parameters, but they haven't told us objectively what. Which clinical signs had to be present, how many clinical signs had to be present, which laboratory parameters had to be positive, what were the cutoffs for breaking the deadlock. That means those in whom the results were inconclusive, that means only 1 positive out of 2, and they needed a tiebreaker, that means something to break the deadlock, they were using clinical signs and laboratory parameters. But how were those defined? And secondly, it is not a good idea to use clinical signs and laboratory parameters to break these deadlocks of inconclusive, because those clinical signs and laboratory parameters are signs of diagnostic uncertainty. I mean, you started off the whole study by saying that those clinical signs were features of diagnostic uncertainty. If those clinical signs were so good as to definitely tell you that they were sepsis, and you're using them to categorize inconclusive patients into sepsis or no sepsis, if those clinical signs were so good, then what was the purpose in doing the whole study at all? You can't say that clinical signs leave you in a state of diagnostic uncertainty, therefore I need to do this study, and then use those same clinical signs with all their fallacies to now decide who is considered positive and who is not considered positive when you have an inconclusive result. So that's not correct. So this is the problem with this paper in the sense that they have used the same clinical signs now to categorize the inconclusive patients. Okay, can we go on to the next question? What are the results?
Dr. Basavaraj, can you please unmute yourself and move ahead with the...
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. Myself, Dr. Basavaraj Sajjan, SR Nephrology from SGPJ, sir.
Good. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Question number 7 is what are the results? The hint given where are the sensitivity and specificity and or likelihood ratios presented? And the second one is, are the results presented in such a way that we can work them out? Sir, yes, sir. They have provided sensitivity and specificity of the PCR test in comparison with the blood cultures. Sensitivity being 100% and the specificity 95.4%, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So how suppose you had to work it out? How would you work it out from this 2x2 table, which is on your screen now?
Yes, sir. They have given 2x2 table. For sensitivity, sir, that is A by A plus C, 95 by 95 plus 0.
No, I don't want A upon A plus B.
Yes.
I want you to speak to me in plain English.
Yes, sir.
A upon A plus B ultimately results in confusion. You have to understand the concept.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. The sensitivity that is true positives being that is proportion of people with conditions who have positive test result. That is here 95 by 95 plus 0 as the PCR test who tested negative were 0.
Yeah. So it is amongst those who are reference standard positive, those who are reference standard positive, what proportion is test positive? That is sensitivity, right? So amongst those who are reference standard positive means amongst 95, because 95 were reference standard positive, right? Here the reference standard is blood culture. What proportion is test positive? So all 95 were test positive. So it's 95 divided by 95, which is 100%. So that is how they got the sensitivity of 100%. How did they get the specificity of 95.4%?
Sir, it is the actually proportion of this is the true negativity, basically true negative patients. That is 583 divided by 611, sir.
Yeah.
So
in simple English, specificity answers the question. Amongst those who are reference standard negative, what proportion are test negative? So amongst those who are reference standard means amongst 611, because 611 were reference standard negative. Yes. Amongst them, what proportion is test negative? So 583 divided by 611.
Yes, sir.
So if you work it out, that works out to be 95.4%.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, how do you calculate positive predictive value?
Sir, positive predictive value, it is the basically proportion of the positive test who have the reference test positive.
Correct. That means amongst those who are test positive, those who are test positive, what proportion is reference standard positive?
Yes, sir.
So that means amongst those who are test positive, that means test positive is 123. So amongst 123, what proportion is reference standard positive? So 95 are positive amongst 123.
Yes, sir.
So 95 by 123 is 77.2%.
2%.
And how do you calculate negative predictive value?
Sir, it is the proportion of negative test who do not have the who have negative this thing, sir. Reference test negative. Correct.
So amongst those who are test negative, what proportion are reference standard negative? So amongst those who are test negative is 583. Amongst them, what proportion is reference standard negative? So all 583 by 583 are reference standard negatives, which is 100%. So the negative predictive value is also 100%. Have they provided the likelihood ratios?
Sir, they have not provided the likelihood ratio, sir.
So did you try and calculate the likelihood ratio?
Yes, sir. Likelihood ratio for positive comes to be 21.7, sir.
Yeah.
And
How you're absolutely right. How did you get to 21.7? What is the
sir,
formula?
it is the actually, sir, sensitivity by 1 minus specificity.
Mm-hmm.
And sir,
In which case you have to convert everything into decimals. Huh? So 100%
yes, sir,
sensitivity is basically equal to 1.
1.
And
And
95.4 basically becomes 0.954.
954. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So it
Uh,
is 1 upon
1
1
minus.
minus 0.954. Huh.
Yes, sir.
So
Yes,
it is 1 divided by whatever,
0.046, sir.
0.046. That gives you 21.7. So the positive likelihood ratio is very high.
Yes, sir.
20. Anything above 10 is excellent positive likelihood ratio.
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
And what about negative likelihood ratio?
Sir, negative likelihood ratio is 0, sir, actually here. Because, sir, it is the 1 minus sensitivity divided by specificity.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So your
as
sensitivity is
1
100%,
only. Yes.
1 becomes 0. Yeah. So obviously, likelihood ratio of 0 is really meaningless. Just
Yes,
as a likelihood ratio of infinity is meaningless. So what a lot of people do is, when it is 0,
yes,
they arbitrarily put a small value there. Okay.
Yes.
So instead of taking sensitivity as 100%, they may take sensitivity as 99.95%, just to get a meaningful value, 99.95%, to avoid the situation that you're talking about. In which case you end up with 1 minus 0.9995. Okay.
Yes.
So in that case, if you do this kind of a statistical jugglery, you get a negative likelihood ratio, which is about 0.005. Okay, which means it's a very small negative likelihood ratio, which again means it's a great test.
Yes.
Okay, now the thing is, the authors, you remember, had said initially that there were inconclusive PCRs, which they later classified as either positive or negative based on clinical signs and other laboratory parameters. And in the results, they have not actually said how many were this kind of inconclusive PCR. We need to know that, right? How many were inclusive? Suppose, their positive PCRs 123. Suppose, it turns out that 50% of them were of this kind type, inconclusive, and then later on classified as either positive or negative based upon clinical signs and other laboratory parameters like CRP. Then I'll be worried that if such a large proportion, the fate of positive and negative has been decided not on the basis of the PCR itself, but based on clinical signs and CRP and leukocyte count, then it's a problem. If those inconclusive ones were very small in number, hardly 2 or 3, then I could say, okay, I'm willing to ignore them. They would not create such a big difference in the final result. But nowhere have they mentioned how many were inconclusive. All right.
Yes.
Okay. So now we go on to question number 8. That's the last question that we will discuss.
Yes, sir. Question number 8 says, how sure are we about the results, consequences, and cost of alternatives performed? Sir, hint given where could they have occurred by chance? Are there confidence limits available? What are they? Sir, sir, they didn't provide confidence limits, sir, actually in paper. And sir, sir, regarding whether it they have occurred by chance, sir, as they have not provided the confidence limits, sir, it is unlikely to say that whether they have occurred by chance or not, sir. If they have provided the confidence in limits, then it would have been.
Yes, and this is the problem I told you, right? A lot of authors simply don't provide the confidence intervals.
Yes, sir.
Here, it is not so much of a problem because they are confident. I have worked out the confidence intervals. Their sample size is so big, 706 patients, that confidence intervals are quite narrow. So
Yes, sir.
that danger of the confidence interval lower bound going very close to the 50% mark, that danger is not there in this study.
Yes, sir.
So I did it on an online calculator, and the exact confidence intervals for sensitivity was from 99.6 to 100%,
Yes, sir.
right? So the point estimate was 100%. The confidence interval starts from 99.6, lower bound. Upper bound, of course, remains 100% only because it can't cross 100%. You see?
Yes, sir.
Because with sensitivity and specificity, there is an upper limit to the confidence interval. It can't cross 100%. So it's 99.6 to 100%. The specificity was 90.4 to 97.8%. Exact confidence interval limits. All right.
Yes.
And similarly, one can calculate the confidence interval limits for the positive and negative likelihood ratio as well. Okay, so we are not going to do the rest of the questions because they're all more to do with applicability. Can the results be applied to your patients and all that? I don't want to get into it because that is a judgment call, so you need to be a neonatologist and be practicing neonatology in your country to be able to decide whether these results can now be applied to your patient or population of interest. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions based on what we have discussed so far.
I think there are some questions in the chat box. So would you like to answer them? Are you able
Yeah,
to see
sure.
the chat box?
I'll first have to stop sharing, then I think then I'll be able to see.
Okay. The first question that has been asked says that when does a new test replace the reference test as a new reference?
Yeah, so partly this is to do with your understanding of the biology of the disease process. If you find that a new test actually is more in sync with your understanding of the biology of the disease process, and it is picking up all those that the previous disease test was picking up and more, then your new test may start replacing the reference standard test. Right? For example, if we have seen in our own lifetimes how for diagnosis of tuberculosis, PCR based methods for tuberculosis, and then after that GeneXpert, which is further sophisticated way of using molecular tests for diagnosing tuberculosis, have now overtaken a culture of acid fast bacilli as the gold standard. So these are the new gold standard now, because you have understood the entire genome of the tuberculosis of bacilli. You have understood that there are certain parts of the genome which are unique to Mycobacterium tuberculosis, not shared by any other living creature. And you have developed a test which is able to pick up copies of that part of the genome at a very, very tiny level. It is picking up every patient who is culture positive and more. So therefore, an expert consensus has evolved that this test should now become the new reference standard test. Right? So, so there is a bit of statistics as well as understanding of the disease that goes into a new test replacing an old reference standard test.
Well, the next question is that won't there be a possibility of not detecting sepsis by the index test as well as the gold standard test? So how does the researcher go about it?
Yeah, that danger is always there. For example, as I told you, the blood culture is not a perfect gold standard. So if there has been, say, prior exposure to antibiotics, or if the blood sample inoculated in the blood culture bottle was less, then the blood culture might itself be a false negative. So, so there are two ways of going about it. One is, at least in the context of a research study, you can make it very stringent that we will enroll only those patients who have not received prior antibiotics. we will enroll only those patients where it is confirmed that adequate amount of blood was sent in the blood culture bottle, etc., etc. You can build in certain precautions to ensure that your reference standard test is not itself going to be false negative. The second thing that you can do is you can a priori decide that it will be blood culture positive and or a clinical course which is highly suggestive of sepsis, and you can make, build in objective criteria like, patient should have, XYZ, clinical criteria, which are signs of sickness. Some laboratory criteria also have to be met. They should end up getting at least 5 days of antibiotics, and there should be an unequivocal response to the antibiotics. So all this put together can be added to blood culture as highly probable sepsis. So your reference standard for a particular study could be blood culture positive and or highly probable sepsis as defined by very stringent criteria to try and avoid this problem of having false negative reference standards. Okay, what is the next question?
Next question is about the 16S RNA gene and PCR. What do they mean? The sequence is of a given bacteria, or would there be not any genetic variation in bacterial RNA? I'm not.
Okay, I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty. I did not want to get into the nitty-gritty of this, but it's very interesting. I have worked a lot on 16S RNA for diagnosis of sepsis myself in neonatology. And what happens is that in a bacterial 16S rRNA gene, so it's basically the gene is DNA. It's a bacterial DNA, which is coding for 16S ribosomal RNA. So this gene is about 1550 base pairs long. Within this gene, there are certain areas which are called highly conserved areas. Those conserved areas are common to all bacteria. They have remained unchanged through evolution for billions of years. And between those conserved regions, there are variable regions and hypervariable regions. They are designated as V1, V2, and they go up to V9. So there are a number of these hypervariable regions. These hypervariable regions, the sequence of nucleotides, adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine, varies between bacterial species. So there are gene banks for all bacteria that are now available, from which you get to know which are the parts of hypervariability which are unique to a given bacterial species. So once you know those hypervariable parts which are unique, you design primers to be able to amplify that variable region. And by sequencing that product, the PCR product, you then get to know which bacterium it is. And it's almost a foolproof method of being able to pick up down to the strain level, not even the species level, down to the strain level, that this is the genetically so and so strain. So I hope that clarifies it.
Well, yes, there are two more questions. One is how can we diagnose non-culturable infections, since the test was compared with blood culture? That is, if the index test is more sensitive than GS, would not its specificity be low?
Absolutely right. So if you think that a lot of neonatal sepsis is occurring because of non-culturable bacteria, then this is absolutely true. That means your index test may actually be better than your gold standard test. And who knows, a day may come when universal primer PCR may actually replace blood culture as a reference standard for diagnosing neonatal sepsis. There are some disadvantages of universal primer PCR. You cannot do antibiotic sensitivity. So for that, you still need to get cultured bacterium. And the second thing is that universal primer PCR is unable to distinguish a dead bacterium from a living bacterium. So it just amplifies DNA, right? So even a dead bacterium's DNA, which is floating around, will get amplified by universal primer PCR. So, but notwithstanding these two disadvantages, there is a good chance that molecular methods may actually replace culture-based methods for the diagnosis of sepsis.
Well, there is a comment that once you put such restrictions on sample selection, then applicability in routine clinical situations will diminish.
Yes, so this is known as the problem of external validity or generalizability. The two mean the same thing. So this is applicable not just to diagnostic test studies, but all kinds of studies, including randomized control trials. That if you have a very large number of exclusion criteria, reasons for which patients will not be there in a study, then the results of your study are now applicable to a very narrow group of patients. They are not applicable to everybody, because those who were excluded from the trial, now the results of the study can no longer be used for those kind of patients. So it is always said that be very judicious about your exclusion criteria. Don't have too many exclusion criteria in any study, because you want your results to be as generalizable as possible.
Well, the last question is, if the index test is performing very well in our study, can we in our analysis try testing our gold standard against the index test and comment the findings in the result?
No, you cannot do that. This is something that you have to decide a priori as to which is your index test and which is your gold standard. You cannot do the study, say that the index test is performing very, now I'm going to make my index test as the gold standard and compare the gold standard against the index test and calculate. It cannot be done. It has to be decided a priori. I mean, if you find that, say, PCR is doing exceptionally well, as a 100% sensitivity, and it is picking up even more than blood culture, and on DNA sequencing, whatever it is picking up, those are, it makes sense that they are pathogens that it has picked up, which are capable of causing neonatal sepsis. Then a future study can have PCR as a gold standard. It is possible, if there is a consensus that builds up around this, that PCR should be now treated as a new gold standard, and you require a consensus. You can't just be sitting in your own center, do your own study, and they say, no, my next study, I'm going to treat this as the gold standard. There has to be a broad consensus globally that this is the new gold standard, and then other tests can now be tested against this new reference standard. Okay, thank you.
Well, we have come to the end of the questions. I want to thank you very, very much for being with us, all the participants, and special thanks to Professor Datta, simply because he was so constrained with the time, but still agreed to our request. Thank you, sir. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, sir. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
And we will come back to you with our next programs, and make sure that you are caught through Valentine or me, that you can't refuse us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.